welcome to Innovation Celebration. We have the absolute joy of having this podcast live today from the European Resource Bank meeting in Stockholm, Sweden. And Innovation Celebration is a show that is dedicated to celebrating advances in science and technology, the people and ideas that make them possible, and the ways in which they enhance human flourishing. I'm Angel Walker-Werth, and this is my husband Thomas.
And today we're interviewing Mattias Svensson, a Swedish libertarian writer and political commentator, especially writes on health policy and environmental policy, and has released 3 books, which we have here on the table, and I'm sure you'll be able to tell us a bit more about those. But I first wanted to start by saying that Sweden's one of my favourite countries on earth. It's very prosperous, it's very safe, it's very clean. How did Sweden become such a successful country compared to elsewhere in Europe and the world?
It's quite a recent development, actually. I mean, Sweden was not the first country to industrialize, and even by the end of the 19th century, it was quite poor. But especially at the beginning, it was corrupt. It was, of course, not a democracy. It was poor, what happens, as in many other countries, is that during the later part of the 19th century, we got rid of the we got freedom of starting companies, and you didn't. Then we had a saying that a shoemaker should always be a shoemaker. And it was quite, when we started to liberalize this, there is a painting in Sweden of how bad it was going to be, or how ridiculous it was going to be when the shoemaker were trying to bake and the baker were trying to sew. Everyone would just change their professions, and then of course nothing would work. But of course that was not what happened. But you got instead a thorough competition, and people could start out. I've written somewhat other subjects, but you can see I've written, for example, on Sweden's alcohol policy, which is a chapter, or rather a book of its own. But you can see people from meager backgrounds moving into a city and starting importing and selling and producing different kinds of liquor and making a living out of that, and living in better conditions than they started with. And this starts in the late 19th century. Sweden started by selling butter and oats to the rest of the world. And because of that, got a loan so that we could build out our railway system and invest in that kind of thing. It was also quite decided by great liberal thinkers like Johan August Gripenstedt and also Lars Johan Hierta, which also started the newspaper Aftonbladet, one of the biggest evening newspapers, and he got censored over and over again, and as the innovator and entrepreneur he was, he issued new publications. So it was Aftonbladet 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and eventually he just mocked the authorities so much they realized they better leave him alone. And of course that was an innovation as well. He got wealthy from it, and of course the audience profited. And as with much of things going on in the market economy, what he did was he turned into a broader audience than just the regular elites. He realized, if I can sell more copies to more people by pleasing their demands, and he was critical, of course, of the powers because that was popular and that was selling, and you cater to the plenty, and that has been quite with Sweden since then. I mean, if you look at H&M, for example, the clothing company, or IKEA, I mean, these are cheap products for most, sold at a small profit per bookshelf or what you sell, but to many, and that enriches both big parts of society and also, of course, the entrepreneur behind it. So it's the same or a similar story as with most countries, but there are, I mean, the beauty of this is that every country have made their own way through to prosperity, and they are similar in some ways, but they also build on individual flourishing and national character and so on.
Certainly, yes. It sounds like you had liberalization allowed for innovation and competition and entrepreneurship, which are common things, but then, as you point out, the particular interests of the people involved in the Swedish character sort of lent its own flavor to it, which is lovely. Going to sort of turn us a little bit in the conversation. You've written on environmental policy and environmental concerns, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how certain innovations in technology will help deal with such environmental concerns as are legitimate. I know you have a few specific examples you can share with us on this.
The thing is, much of what has happened can be illustrated in the story of one Swedish company called Rönnskärsverken, a smelter in northern Sweden that takes processes from the mines and makes metals. This was started in 1930, and we immediately got to be Sweden's largest emitter. No problems, because we have built the highest smokestack in all of Europe, 145 meters, because that was the wisdom of the day. If the smokestack is high enough, or the plumbing is long enough, you can keep your problems away from you.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yes, and I mean of course, I mean they realized emissions create local problems, but the conception of that environmental problems, that emission could travel, for example, over national borders. That's an insight not really taking place until 1970s, 1980s, much later. So this was the wisdom of the day, and in 1933 they emitted as most, that was most of the sulfur, 180,000 tons per year. And they of course was Sweden's largest emitter by then, and that is also a thing to. I mean, you tend to reason that all the emissions are increasing and increasing and increasing. Most of them are not, and sulfur is just one of the biggest examples of that. The peak was in 1933. And what happened then was they realized these are quite potent chemicals we're just letting out in the air. Why not make chemicals of it and sell it to the chemical industry? So sulfuric acid and other components were made out of the smokes. They were rest products that you got commercial use of, and in that way could make a saleable product. And I mean that's how most fuels and everything has started to be used. I mean when you were I forget the name for what you fired lamps with before.
Paraffin.
Yes. I mean gas was a rest product that you just spilled out in the beginning, and then you made something of it. And in this case, you also decreased the emissions quite a lot. Then you go to around circa 1970, and then you get some. We got this authority and politics for emissions, and you realize then the emission of sulfur is around 70,000 tons a year. So I mean it's more than half since the beginning, but it's still quite a lot. And they also started diving and measuring, and they realized that the bottom of the sea is totally dead, kilometers around here. I wonder why. Well, it might be the 2,000 tons of arsenic you put in the water every year, and also thousands or hundreds of tons of heavy metals of different kinds and so on. And so there was a real cause for concern from authorities, and then it was like the company said, the authorities said, well, you can't really proceed like this, and the company said, well, we hear you, but unfortunately it would be too expensive to clean this up. And then started a bit of regulation, a bit of taxation of emissions, regulating these kind of quite hazardous and emissions, and also a thing that shows when you started this, as has been noted in other countries, is that companies, the costs are usually not that high that you expected. It's in a way the antithesis is to infrastructure projects that are always more expensive than you project. Environmental reducing emissions are usually cheaper than expected, and that is because incremental innovation in a way, and that has taken place until the beginning of the 2000s. Rönnskärsverken, while producing more, are emitting 3,000 to 4,000 tons of sulfur. Still Sweden's highest emitter, so they're not atypical in this. From 180,000 to 3,000 to 4,000, and other the heavy metals are down to some tons a year instead of hundreds or thousands. So it's been an enormous progress, but unnoticed, since it takes place over time, gradually, incrementally. Some of it due to regulation, but to follow regulation, you still have to innovate and keep competitive. And that is another thing with Sweden is a small country. You can't really produce only for the Swedish market. So most of our all of our big companies and most of our companies also in the rural areas. I mean, there's been a lot of talk in the United States about the losers from globalization. If you go out in Swedish rural areas, you will probably find some of the winners of globalization, a specialized small company that has quite a large niche of the world market for their specialized product. Because if you have to pay Swedish salaries, you have to be really good at what you do and be quite technically advanced. But all over the country, there are companies living up to that. And so Rönnskärsverken illustrates that innovation, some regulation that is not out to kill what you actually do and produce, but lets you produce that with the smallest amount of emission and incremental development, where you produce more but emit less. And that was doable in this case, and this is of course the transmission you want to accomplish with environmental policy and help along with environmental policy?
Yeah, there's a difficult question in terms of the role of government here, because so from our point of view, the role of government is very much to protect people's rights, and you know, as far as the environmental debate is concerned, there tend to be two camps. One is, you know, because of climate change, we must regulate everything and, you know, achieve net zero and massively constrain human flourishing in the process, stop people from flying, all that kind of stuff. And on the other hand, there's just outright denial of climate change, it's not real, and there's nothing in between. And what I would like to see is the government keeping to its role of protecting rights, and things like arsenic in the water supply or sulfur in the air that affects people's ability to live their lives or fish or, you know, carry out their business. Those are situations where pollution has a real impact on people's lives, and there is a role potentially for government to make sure that people aren't violating each other's rights in what they put in the air and in the water, but then staying out of the way of innovation, letting us continue to live, because human life going on and flourishing should always be the goal at the end of the day.
Yes, and that is also the way of handling. I mean, by far the most deadly environmental problem is still indoor air. When people have to make a fire inside, I mean that kills around, I think it's about 3.8 millions a year, mostly women and children. And that is because of poverty. I mean, any industrialization, no matter how dirty, is a step toward a better environment for those human beings. And if you can take those steps as efficiently as possible with the cleanest technology as possible, that is for the benefit of all. And you should have respect for people's will to live. I mean, have the same development as our countries have experienced, and that means having a dynamic economy that can adapt, that experiments that are all the time doing this, and the market economy is vital to this. I mean, the most dramatic decrease in emissions are made from the pricing system, because resources cost. Throwing things away is a cost, and at least an alternative cost. So these kinds of things are always with the entrepreneurs, and sometimes it can help to think of the environment as well. When Walmart was looking into what can we do for the climate, they realized that well, we can save a lot of money from adapting temperatures in our warehouses and so on. So they consumed less fuel, had lower costs, and were doing things that were good for both profits and environment. Of course, it's not always that simple. I think you as well need to price emissions, and you should realize that it's always kind of a trade-off. But I think the rule of thumb that you can use is that you expect progress in the economy. You expect the same progress in the environment. You expect more over time, and that can be consumed as economic growth, which of course you can't plan that. Oh, we should have exactly that, even though politicians try to pretend. And of course you can pretend that we should have that exactly pattern of emission reductions. Usually you don't, but over time you get development even here with known regulation as some bans, but mostly pricing of emissions.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to take us on another handbrake tour. One of the other topics you write a lot about is health policy. And specifically, you mentioned your history of alcohol policy in Sweden, but some other topics as well. Starting out fairly broadly, which policies would you say, when it comes to health, are encouraging innovation in this absolutely vital field for human flourishing, and which policies have you seen to be the most of a hindrance to innovation?
Yeah, what we see here is more. I mean, I write a lot about paternalism, nanny state regulation. So you mostly get demonstration by the opposite. I mean, this is usually the measure to make people healthy, but you don't work with people, but try to override their decisions because you don't think that ordinary people can make decisions for themselves. What I've realized over and over again with these regulations is how counterproductive they are, and how much that can flourish even in these areas, because people tend to not want to be dependent on substances. People tend to value. If you ask people what are their concerns, I mean, health comes really high up there. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean we always make decisions with our longer term health as a main focus, and good riddance, what a boring life that would be. But we still have a lot of interest in that shows in usually in what happens when you have restrictions. So there are a lot of examples. When one thing is that in Sweden, in the end of the 19th century, we started a regulation that it was for the working men, of course, because the middle classes and the better educated, of course, could handle themselves. But they were concerned politicians of those day elites. They thought about the working class, and they wanted the working class to have nice restaurants to go to where they would eat properly and not drink as much. So what do? Of course, you make it mandatory to order a meal if you want to drink, and you should have a limit on how much drink is served, and for the purpose of administering, it's most easy if you only serve booze, which is what Sweden mostly did, and so you could have 3 shots as a male, half as female, and you had to order a meal. So then people, of course, would eat and not drink, and that is what happened in the rural areas, because then you would go to the only place, you would order a meal, drink your shots, and then go home. But then there was, you might realize what happened in bigger areas. They realized that there's kind of a lot of drunkenness here. What's going on? And a former policeman who was now working for the government, the city with serving, he started. Is the personnel do they serve too much? But he checked them. No, they're not. So what's going on here? And he realized that people went to one place, ordered the mandatory dinner, which of course was the cheapest one on the menu, that was called a lot of names, because, and then you got your 3 shots, and then they didn't go home. They went to the next place, ordered a mandatory deal. So in one in Gothenburg, they arrested a man with 10 boiled eggs in his in his suit. That was of course a mandatory food from 10, so he was drunk as an egg. And then that's where the term bar round came from in Sweden, because you made a bar. One interesting thing is what first, where they actually ate the food. The other, they put in the food and then they put it out again. They could use the same food, serving a lot of, and this got ritualized over time. So sometimes people, to stop this, put a cigarette butt in the food, but not even that stopped people from. So you had to be really careful if you were ordering the cheapest stuff on the menu. You had to really make clear that I intend to eat this. if you were about, and there are stories all over Sweden about shocked personnel. That, oh no, you were supposed to eat that. Well, let me. So. You earned more from serving worse food, and that was the economy of it. And know what these restrictions over the years made of Sweden, because we didn't ban, but we heavily regulated. We imposed this system until 1955 in all of Sweden, and what happened was the total death of eating culture in Sweden, because if you were desperate enough to go out, it had to be for the liquor. So you accomplished by regulating the exact opposite of what you wanted to accomplish.
Yeah, it reminds me of the sugar taxes that have come in Britain recently, and they've had two main consequences. The government's moronic idea was that if they tax sugary drinks like sodas, people will drink them less, and instead what happens is poor people spend more money on sugary drinks, or drinks companies put aspartame and other sweeteners in their drinks instead of sugar, which is really less healthy. So that you either end up making people poorer or making them less healthy than they were before.
Sugar is another great example. Actually, we have it shows the effect of taxes, and it's one of my favorite examples. We have smuggling to Denmark. Because Denmark had quite high sugar taxes, so we have regular smuggling of candy and illegal candy sellers in Denmark selling candy that are non-taxed, and of course people buy it on travel, as in Sweden. I mean. One other thing in Swedish culture is the whole premise of one of the most popular films in the 1980s, Sällskapsresan. It's people going to Gran Canaria in Spain, and it's not only for the sun in the Swedish winter, but also for the alcohol you could buy, because if you could buy 1 liter of liquor. And if you got to a special place, you could also bring a bottle of wine. But if you got liquor in a bottle of wine, you could bring 2 liters. and two of the guys that are also into drinking everything tax-free, so that the travel will pay for itself. They are also on the hunt for this place where they plumb liquor into wine bottles, so that you could get 2 liters into Sweden instead of 1.
The smuggling into Denmark actually leads us quite nicely onto our next question, which is going outside of health policy, just innovation generally and entrepreneurship generally. How much are international borders, a barrier to innovation and economic growth, and how much does free movement of people and goods help?
I mean, for a small country like Sweden, I mean, as I was into before, I mean, the world is our market, and you can't make a serious product without having the market mainly outside Sweden, and that means you have to cater to populations and so on. That makes for what the economist Ruchir Sharma calls good billionaires instead of bad billionaires. The bad billionaires are the one with political clout and usually in the extracting industries, classical example. But most of Sweden's billionaires are the kind that cater to audiences outside of Sweden and mainly outside political clout.
So sort of real capitalists rather than cronies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so of course, I mean, the ability to move is of course vital for finding those markets and also finding all the inputs, because it definitely goes both ways, and also for all kinds of, I mean, experiences, experiencing something unusual, picking up ideas, studying, and everything like that. Of course, that's vital.
Yeah.
So relatedly, when we're talking about innovation and entrepreneurship, can you tell us about the free speech scene in Sweden? What that's been like, and a little bit about, I think it's fairly obvious, hopefully, that you need free speech for innovation, but it gets a little bit gray, I think, to some people when you're talking about, well, what about research in particular areas that some people find objectionable and things like that, and I think that's where it gets really tricky when it comes to innovation. So can you just talk about what the situation is regarding that here in Sweden?
Yeah, it's a bit. We're a bit like. I mean, much of that is regulated in Europe these days, and so, for example, genetically modified products have not made headway in Swedish. That's not really a debate issue. I mean, it's not that there's a ban on what you can say on what's good with genetically modified plants, but since it's not demonstrated, it's not a big issue, unfortunately. And this is, I think that is the case, rather than you can't introduce different topics. And then, of course, Sweden is much of a consensus culture where it's, I mean, it's not that you regulate, but that you have the platforming, or we don't have these many arenas for speech, so that it's easy to be beside the mainstream, and that is usually how voices are not listened to.
Somebody's voices are definitely being listened to.
Yeah. Students celebrating for the first time in a few years. I think we should welcome it.
Cool. So our last sort of main question on our list is specifically drug policy and how restrictions on.
Wait, one thing about, I mean, there's also the commercial speech. And being able to make your product known, and that has, I mean, if you're familiar with a Swedish liquor brand, that's probably Absolut Vodka, and that was actually brought forward by a state monopoly on all liquor. Which has a long history, but they realized they could only sell to the retail monopoly in Sweden, and things were turning sour because the retail monopoly were into selling wine, because wine is middle class and is more proper and regular than selling booze, and you get to travel to France to buy it, and that's nice. So the two state monopolies were in kind of a clash. So what do they? Well, if we can't sell to our only customer in Sweden, we should sell it abroad. And they developed this. And what can we do? In the same year, they decided to go along with this. Advertising for liquor was banned in Sweden. But the mother of all commercial campaigns sold hard liquor in the rest of the world, bringing money to the state monopoly, and that is how one of the big business successes still is a big business success in Sweden. So that tells you the value of being able to be heard commercially, because nowadays when you have, for example, we have an explosion of whiskey producers and so on, and they want to find a market abroad as well. They have to, under the European standardization, they have to follow the stricter Swedish rules on commercial. So they have trouble communicating their products with with buyers and customers abroad. And that's of course okay. That's liquor. You're gonna find it anyway. But it shows that the value of being able to communicate that we have a new product. I mean, it's fun. It makes for our care for small differences that make life more enjoyable and more to choose from. But it's also, I mean, it's vital for companies' success and the ability of growing.
Just a quick clarification question on that. When you say that it was a state monopoly on liquor, was it a private company that was being granted special privileges, or was it a state-owned enterprise?
It was kind of both. It's a fantastic history. It's why I've written a whole book on alcohol policy. It was one person, Ivan Bratt, who was a politician, an entrepreneur, and a doctor and a social activist all at once. He got control of the retail monopoly in Stockholm, and gradually during the First World War, when most people had other things to think about, he went around to all the producers saying, well, it would be tough if no one bought from you. Do you want to sell to me? He gave them an offer he cannot refuse, and that created a company kind of in a legal void. So the whole Swedish system was created by an entrepreneur, not really under the laws or anything, but with great ability to move, which has caused several corruption scandals as well.
Yeah, I like Ayn Rand's idea of, we have this principle of separation of church and state, and there should be a separation of economics and state.
Yeah, and I definitely believe in the separation of drugs and state, because the state can't handle it.
Yeah, so that was my last question, really. Our last question was restrictions on drugs. Obviously, if somebody wants to get high for the fun of it, that's really none of the state's business, but moreover, restricting drug research like cannabis research and things like that has a lot of consequences in slowing down developments of cures, treatments, medical developments as well. So I know you've been to a couple of cannabis conferences and things like that. Do you have any insights on what we're missing out potentially because of that regulation?
I don't. The thing is, you don't know. And the potentials are huge. I mean, there's a book from a recent book on Swedish psychedelic history from one of the lefty author that I just read, and it has been quite dead for 50 years, even though many of the research areas were quite promising, and we see a recent restart in the development. Then we also have this. We have great barriers to new innovations, and that is one of the reasons that this is not researched on, because you cannot make a lot of money from it, because it's products already existing, so you can't patent it. And we've created a system of patents and controls that make it so expensive to develop new products, and it also creates a pattern for what we regard as medicine and as treatment. That is, it works fine, but this shows that there are other areas, there are things that should be researched on that could potentially lead to cheaper and better treatments that we don't get with this extremely regulated and extremely making it expensive system that we have today, and that is a call for simpler rules and maybe not the same patent system, because I believe it, of course, in that you should make money from an innovation and so on, have some kind of first serve, but the exact amount of how much that should be and how many years and so on, that has been gradually expanded in the interest of companies, but not the consumers, I think. So that has been a good idea has been kidnapped and become more crony than capitalism in later years. And I think that not more happening in the medical potential of these kind of drugs is one example of what could be developed, but what hasn't.
Yeah. If people were getting their entertainment drugs from companies rather than from criminals, then some of that funding would probably find its way back into research and.
Oh yes, and also you should work with people on this. And we have another example of this is what's called snus, oral tobacco. It's very big in Sweden. So we have the lowest rate of smokers anywhere in the developed world, and we have a quite unique pattern of this, because at least a couple of years ago, we are the only country with lower male smokers, lower share of male smokers than female smokers, and that is because oral tobacco is mostly used by men. So this has most people stop smoking, just stop smoking. Some are helped by medical, but some are also helped by going over to oral tobacco, which gives them kicks, but not the same health risk, not by far the same health risk as smoking every day. No one says it's your perfect health kick, but I mean, people want their stimulants, and if you work to give them easier stimulants, I mean, and of course give the commercial flavor that you could spread this instead. That is usually both the lesser evil, but also more fun.
Yeah, it's like when in landscape architecture, you talk about desire lines, or in urban planning, it's where people are going to walk anyway. They're going to walk across that nice square of grass you just put there. So make the path there anyway. That's where they're going to go.
Yeah, people will always do what people want.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think
that wraps up our questions. Do you have any final comments on innovation or entrepreneurship before we open it up to see if our lovely audience has any questions?
Oh, there's so much to say, but you had quite a few questions, so I think we covered a lot.
We did indeed.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have some folks joining us today. Do any of you have any questions, primarily for Mattias, but we can answer questions as well? Crickets?
No,
we cleared everything.
We can stop the live stream and say thank you very much once more.
All right. Thank you, Mattias. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for tuning in to Innovation Celebration.
Thank you.
All right.